Hi, my name's Justin Schupp and I'm the founder and CEO here at PatchMyPC. In this video, I'm going to be showing you some new features that we've implemented within the PatchMyPC publisher from April till October 2021. So these are kind of more larger features that we think are relevant sharing with you. There's going to be plenty of minor features and bug fixes that we won't be covering in this video. So there's about 30 or so that we'll be looking at. And most of these came through our user voice channel where you can submit feedback. So if you go to ideas.patchmypc.com, this is where we get feedback from customers and ultimately add new products as well as new features based on the feedback that we're seeing there. So if you're not familiar with that and you browse over here, you can either submit a new request, or if it's something that you find for something you want, you can vote up existing requests and you'll get notified if we make progress on that specific item that you'd like to see added, whether it's a new product or a new feature. From this same page in the header, you can also click our public roadmap. So if you click here, generally we keep about the last 5 to 6 months of new features that we've shipped. So for example, we currently see from April till October 2021. This will include both new features as well as new products. So new products would be listed in the dark blue, just new products that we're adding to the catalog. Everything else would be feature-specific items that we've added to the publisher and or services. So with that said, let's jump right in. And the first feature that we're going to be looking at that we've added are role scopes for Intune. So the scope tags feature, if we go and look at Intune, for example, this is where you can have different scope tags that you can choose which admins can see which objects. In our specific case, these would be the applications and updates that we're creating. So to access this feature, we can either apply these scope tags to all applications within our product. So we can right-click the All Products level and click Manage Role Scope Tags. And then by default, we're just going to add the default scope tag just like anything else in Intune. Now, if you wanted to say only specific admins, part of specific scope tags, can see it, you could assign that to every application in your org that we're creating for you by right-clicking All Products. Now, if you wanted to, you could also set scope tags on specific vendors. So let's say, for example, if we go over to Google, we could say we want any Google product that we enable down the vendor tree. We could have specific scope tags assigned there as well. Or if we wanted to set it for a specific product, we can right-click at the product level to only apply a scope tag to that individual product. Another feature that we've implemented on the Intune specific apps and updates is there's a new right-click option. And we have the option to set a custom description and icon for the application or update. So this feature was around for ConfigMgr Apps for quite a while. Generally speaking, we find it's not used that often because we do have the default description of the product we set for you, as well as the default icon for that product. But some customers do have specific use cases where they wanted to set something very specific, and they can now do that for our Intune apps. Now, another new feature specific to ConfigMgr Apps, if we go and let's just go look at Google Chrome, for example, we do have new right-click options to set different requirement settings. Now, if I click on the 32-bit version of Chrome, for example, we can set different requirements for these applications. So the specific ones that we've implemented since April would be all 3 of these actually. So we can set a requirement that the application could only install on a workstation operating system. It could only install on a server operating system. And if it's a 32-bit application, we can also say don't allow it to install on a 64-bit OS. So if you wanted to make sure that you're not deploying 32-bit specific applications on accident, you could set the requirement so that they would only be applicable on a 32-bit OS. So definitely a helpful feature for different ways to limit the application targeting based on requirements, regardless of how broad the collection is that you deploy to. Also here in the ConfigMgr Apps option, if I click on my options menu, one new feature that's actually quite helpful is we can now retain up to a specific number of old versions. So the way this worked before, if we had the update in place enabled, what would happen is it would only keep the latest version of the application in ConfigMgr. So for example, if you were to update to a new version, you would only have the latest one. So we implemented a feature that says even if you're updating the latest application each time so that the first application is always retained and up to date, so you don't have to modify task sequences to get the latest version. We included this option where you can also copy and duplicate and keep up to 3 older versions whenever we create a new application. So this would allow you to roll back in the event that you ever had any issues, but you can still use this feature even if the original app is always staying up to date. We'll essentially duplicate that and keep up to 3 old apps. This feature would also be available if you use the create new application each time, and then it would only retain up to 3 applications instead of keeping all applications if you were choosing the create new. So definitely a helpful feature to be able to potentially roll back in the event that you ever had any issues with the latest version of a product. Now, another feature that we have specific to the Intune App Manager, if we click on Intune Apps and then we open the query option, this will show us all the apps that are published as well as their assignments. We have a variety of new right-click options that we can click that allow you to interact with the application. So for example, you can view in the endpoint portal. That's going to open the app directly in Intune and show you details about that specific application. We can also right-click, do things like manage the assignments. If you wanted to add one real time, we could manage the enrollment status page assignments, delete assignments, or the application. So these right-click menus are going to be all new within the publisher. Now, one feature that is actually pretty highly requested, this is applicable for any tab, both ConfigMgr Apps, Updates, Intune Apps, Intune Updates. If we right-click on a product, so we'll look at Google Chrome, and if you're using the Manage Conflicting Processes to either automatically close and or notify the user, the option, so let's just choose the option to notify the user. If you click the Manage Process list, you can add any processes that you want. So by default, for example, this is Google Chrome, so we added the main file chrome.exe. Now, there are scenarios where people want to add different executables that may be applicable that we don't include by default. So one example is maybe the Zoom plugin. Maybe you want to check additional processes like Outlook.exe and or other processes. So this just gives you more control where if we check for conflicting processes, you can add any additional process that you want that could also be used to detect if something needs to happen in that specific scenario. Another pretty highly requested one, if we go and look at our alerts tab, we've had Microsoft Teams alerts via webhook for quite a while now, but now we also have support for Slack. So if you were using Slack, we can send messages via Slack. And in addition to Slack, you can also use Discord via the Slack webhook type if you wanted to as well. So if you were using a Slack webhook, you could simply choose the dropdown and then add the webhook URL, and then we would send it in a Slack format that looks very nice and is formatted well. Now, an additional feature that we did to help handle assignments better, specifically to Intune, let's just say we were publishing Google Chrome, and let's say that we had an assignment configured. We have this new option. So the way that it would typically work is we would only create an assignment once, and we wouldn't recheck if anything had changed. So for example, let's say that we have it deployed to all devices. That would originally create that assignment the first time. But what we didn't check is have any settings changed since we originally created that assignment. So for example, let's say that you said don't show any notification at all. That would not automatically update on reoccurring syncs because the assignment was already created. We have this option where we can now overwrite existing assignment settings in the event that something has changed that we can update within Intune. So basically there's just the checkbox where we can overwrite existing assignments that match if a setting has changed. So quite helpful in the event that you change something and you wanted to have that reflect within Intune. Another feature that we've added specific to WSUS updates is on the Updates tab. If you right-click the Show Package Info, you now have the ability in this view to double-click a specific update, and it will show you the applicability rules that we use for that update, even if it's not published to WSUS yet. So this makes it so you can look at applicability rules, even if the update doesn't already exist in WSUS. Now, the feature to view applicability rules have been a while in the run updates wizard, where you could come in here and you could view the applicability rules if it's already existing in WSUS. But this allows you to view it even if it's not published via the right-click option where you can show all the different updates and view applicability even when not published. So quite helpful. There we go. Now, I will mention this isn't in any particular order by screen. We're actually reviewing features kind of by the release date. So we may jump around and actually view different screens multiple times. But the next thing that we're going to look at is the manage conflicting process. If you're using the notify feature, we now have the ability to detect if it's in presentation mode. So, if they're in a full screen mode using PowerPoint, we have the ability to detect both Focus Assist and presentation mode. And in the event that setting is enabled, we could not show the notification if they are in presentation or Focus Assist mode. All right, now the next feature, if we go to our database scan tool, where we can query the ConfigMan database and click Query, one improvement that we made on the export, let's say that you're using the filter feature, and let's say that I only want to see products installed on greater than 10 machines. The way that it used to work is the export would not include filtered results. So now when you click export, you can choose to only export the scan data based on your results, which in our case would be 10 or more machines. So just an improvement. Rather than exporting everything, we have the ability to only export based on the filters if you defined any filters that you wanted to include in the export. Another new feature is we now support scopes within ConfigMgr. So let's say that, let's say Google Chrome, let's say you only wanted specific administrators to see that. Similar to the way that we added scope tags for Intune, we also support setting security scopes now for a Configuration Manager application. So if you had any custom scopes in ConfigMan, you could limit applications created from the publisher to specific administrators that have access to that specific scope. One feature that we added on the General tab is we now have basic usage statistics within the publisher itself. So for example, you'll be able to see the lifetime data for how many apps that you've created, how many updates you've created, as well as how many CVEs that you've published within your environment. You can also see things like the last sync that occurred, the next sync, and then the total number of synchronizations that's occurred within the publisher itself. So just giving you some basic stats to show you the benefit and all the apps and updates and security fixes that have been created via the publisher. Now, if we jump back into the Show Package Info screen, we've made some improvements in this wizard where you can now copy and paste specific rows and columns of these results. So for example, we could say, I want to copy the vendor name, probably more common. Maybe you want to copy the download URL. So you could copy download URL and then, try to manually download if you're having issues. You could copy things like the file hash. One thing that you can also do, if you click the hash, it will take you out to virus total, where you can see scan data for that specific binary in our catalog real time. So just a few different features that we've added to include right click, where you can copy both rows and specific columns within the package details tab. Another improvement that we made for Intune Apps and Updates is if you look at the Intune apps once they've been created, we'll now specify the disk space requirement. So this one that we're looking at now is 7-zip, so it only requires 1 meg. But this will now be configured for any apps created by PatchMyPC, where you can see the actual estimated disk space size for that specific product. Now, one feature that we've added on the back end, if we look at our updates, we have this option where we can automatically clean up deleted and obsolete updates from the Update Services Packages folder. That will save a lot of space for old outdated packages within the WSUS Updates folders that don't typically get cleaned up by the default WSUS Server Cleanup wizard. We also have a new feature, it's not enabled by default for this one, where we can automatically run the cleanup, which will help clean up the WSUS content folder, unlike the Update Services Packages. So the top one is enabled by default. That can have a big impact. And we also would recommend enabling the automatic cleanup, but we opted not to enable that automatically so that you have a bit more control over not just having that automatically run. Now, we also added an option where you can re-sign updates that have already been published to WSUS. So the scenario here is, let's say that you had a WSUS signing certificate, and for whatever reason it was changed. Now, by default, we do timestamp updates. That means that they will still be trusted even after the expiration date. So re-sign isn't actually typically required unless there's some type of business need where you say, maybe I've changed from a self-signed certificate to a PKI certificate, and any existing updates I want to republish or re-sign so that they use the new certificate. So there's an option now in the WSUS options. When you click the Modify Published Updates wizard, you have a new screen where you can choose to re-sign the update, which will basically re-sign the existing update that's published, but it will update it to use the new code signing certificate for WSUS in the event that it's been updated. So just a new quality of life in the event that you did change your certificate. You don't have to go and republish or recreate every single update. You can simply re-sign those if they do need to use the new certificate. Another feature improvement that we made around Intune is if we click on the Intune options, when we actually test our application ID and our application secret that gives us permissions to your Intune tenant, we will now give you a checkbox of the different permissions that we have and let you know whether or not that the appropriate permissions are applied. And we can even mention if there's over permissions, we'll even say, hey, you don't need that permissions with a warning. And then if we did not have appropriate permissions, you would just see a red X. And at that point, you could click the more info and you could see specifically how you could create that app registration permissions to ensure that we have what we need in order to interact with Intune and Intune applications. Another feature request that we've got are, we had a lot of customers that said, I want to export a list of the products, including all the custom right-click options that I may have applied. Previously, this wasn't possible, but now in the Advanced tab, if you go and choose the Export, you have the ability to choose which products that you want to export, and then it will automatically export. So I'll just say on my desktop. There we go. And then it will show all the apps that you have selected, including all of the custom right-click options, just for reference if you wanted to see which ones may have custom scripts or right-click options or any of those custom settings that you can apply. And you can have it all in a single document to see what changes you may have made from the default settings. Alrighty, so another feature that we've improved is if we right-click and if we're using the custom pre or post scripts. Previously, you would only be able to add pre or post scripts on the install action. So these custom scripts would only be applied during the installation of an application or an update within the environment. But what we've done is we've added a new tab for uninstall. So if you had any custom pre or post scripts that you wanted to launch before the uninstall within the deployment type, you would be able to also launch any type of script pre or post uninstall within these apps and updates. So definitely a helpful feature if you had maybe some type of custom cleanup that you wanted to perform for either an app or an update. Another feature, if you're using the right-click option and you're using the feature to show, let me just go find Notepad, for example. If you're using Manage Conflicting Processes, and if you're notifying the user in the event they have an app open that needs to be closed, this will now apply for both installations, which that was always the case, but will also now show the notification if you're deploying it as a uninstall type for an application. So you could say, we need to uninstall it. You'd have to close the app in that scenario as well. In the event, there's some products that, and we have this documented in this wizard, that we know if the app's open, they will likely fail both in the installation step as well as the uninstallation step. So you can check out this KB. There's only about 8 or so products that we're actively tracking that we know need to be closed. So this is really where you might use this. But the new feature is this will also show during an uninstall type. You'll see the pop-up for the end user as well, which we'll actually take a look at here in a few seconds. All right, next feature around alerts, and specifically the Teams and Slack webhook. You can now have multiple webhooks within the notification channel, where before you could only have one. So maybe you have multiple channels and you want to have webhooks post to each. You could have multiple different channels getting notifications within here. We also have an option where you can choose what channels get what type of notifications. So by default, they're going to get everything. That would include both new updates that were published, any failed updates. But what we've also added is you can choose to only spend it to send success or error messages to specific channels as well. So maybe you wanted one channel to only get errors and you wanted another one to get everything or only successes, for example. You have more control in the number of channels you get as well as what gets sent for different types of notifications. Another feature improvement around the uninstallation of applications is we will also generate the managed installation log, both for the installation, which was always the case, but also the uninstallation of applications or updates. If it's an MSI, we'll also now support appending the logging switch for the uninstall command line as well. And it would just use the location that you've defined within the right-click option for the logs. Another new feature that will kind of piggyback off the alerts, both for email and the Teams alerts, is if the publisher is updated, so in our case, it was actually updated today, you'll actually now start to get alerts that let you know, hey, the publisher was updated. Do you want to see the release notes of the new features for that release? So for example, we can see this will go right out to our docs whenever there's a self-update that's been applied, and you can actually stay informed about what new features have come out for that specific update. So for example, we can see the improvements around conflicting processes. We can see the different ideas that we've shipped these features for based on that user voice. So definitely helpful to kind of stay up to date with what's going on in the environment. We've also improved some alerts if the self-update feature fails. We'll attempt to send a Teams or email alert letting you know that something happened and we couldn't self-update the publisher in the event that that were to happen. We also will include the time zone for any of the alerts as well for the Teams webhook. So for example, we can see the server that was sending this specific alert was sending it based on Mountain Standard Time when the update was actually published. So not just the time that Teams is running in, to let you know when it actually occurred on the machine running the publisher. Now, one feature that's also quite helpful is for the alerts for the manage conflicting process. So if I go look at Notepad++ again, manage conflicting process, we did implement a new feature that says to use the Configuration Manager max runtime for the update. So previously this was hard coded to 5 minutes, and that's because the max runtime for software updates is 10 or 15 minutes depending on the update type when third-party updates are published. So what that actually meant is we couldn't actually display a notification that was longer than the max runtime for the update. So to actually show you what this means from a config manager perspective when I'm talking about the max runtime is if I click on properties of Notepad++, and if I look at the max runtime, this by default is 10 minutes. Now what I did in the background before I deployed this is I set it to 3 hours or 180 minutes. So what this option is saying is if you're adjusting the max runtime, you can also set our timeout for the pop-up, which I'll show you in a second, to use the max runtime for this specific update that's being deployed. So for example, I'm going to go to a client machine. I can see that I currently have Notepad++, and I do have the manage conflicting process set to notify the user based on that configuration we were looking at. So if I click on install, what we should hopefully see with the max runtime option enabled, we set this to be 15 minutes under the max runtime, which was 3 hours. And that additional 15 minutes just ensures that we have enough time once the UI closes for the pop-up to actually install the application. So this just allows you to be more flexible and give your end users more time for the max runtime for updates. So for example, we could choose close and update, and then it will close Notepad and start the installation. But it really just allows you to give your end users more time as long as you're aware that you do need to adjust the max runtime to really get any additional time versus the default of 15 minutes. Now, this feature has also been improved on the Configuration Manager apps as well. So if you're using Manage Conflicting Process, you can use the Configuration Manager max runtime, which is, I believe, an hour by default. And the same setting also now applies for Intune, where you can set, let's just look at Notepad, because that's really the app that would have issues. So if you're using the Manage Conflicting Process, you can use the Intune max runtime, which would be 60 minutes as well. And then we have our 15-minute buffer. So this just allows you to configure the max runtime for each scenario rather than the default of 5 minutes, which was also a user voice request from our customers. Yep. And then another feature, we also implemented the retain application feature within Microsoft Intune as well. So if you wanted to retain a specific number of previous versions, you could use that to roll back in the event that you needed to. All right, now 2 new features that we've actually just implemented in today's release of 2.11 is some improvements around the notifications as well as the ConfigMgr App republishing. So for example, let's say that we're using the timeout feature for an update and we're showing the notification. So if I click Manage Conflicting Processes, before this was a hard-coded notification that only supported English. So if we click on the Manage Global Settings now, what we can do is we can define specific wording if we wanted to change the message. So this can be helpful. For example, let's say that you had different types of languages that you support, right? So let's say Swedish was a language. You wanted to add that and click OK. You could automatically change and have a custom message for these different languages. So for example, if we click and show the default language, it's in English. And you can also see the different type of variables that you can copy here as well. So things like your org name, the product name that's being updated, how many times a user has already deferred the update, and then the date as well. So for example, you could type this in any type of language like Swedish, for example, and you could make this message say whatever you wanted to on the end user side. So just to show you a quick idea again of what this actually looks like on the client side, we can see this is kind of the default verbiage that we can see is currently in use within the notification. And if you don't set anything custom, that's just going to be the way that it would show up. And we can see that corresponds to exactly what is going on here as well. But let's say that you did want to add multiple languages, right? We will automatically detect the language of the computer that it's running on, and it would show whatever custom message in whatever language that you type here, including any of the variables that you want to use on the client side so that it's localized for what you may need in the event that you're using multiple languages, or even in the event that if you were using English, but you just wanted to change some of the words around or make it shorter or longer, it could also allow you to change the policy as well for just how it would show in English as well. So this was a heavily requested feature and something we think will provide a lot of value, especially for those that are using more than one languages where it used to be hard-coded to just English. And then the last feature that we have to cover is there's a few new options on the ConfigMgr Apps and then our Intune Apps and Updates. So the new feature is, let's say that you had an application published for ConfigMgr. We have this new right-click feature that says to republish it during the next update. So what this will actually do, and the use case is probably less often in the ConfigMgr Apps versus the Intune Apps, and I'll explain why. So in the Configuration Manager apps, this would only really be relevant if there's been an update to our customization file that is included in the package that fixes some type of specific issue that you were having, which generally doesn't happen all that often, but there may be a use case where, let's say that we did have a fix that we had on the script runner side that includes this customization. This would allow you to re-update the content for that script runner binary without having to delete and recreate the app. So this would generally only be a specific use case when you're working with support and we're aware of something that we fixed. Now, one thing that we did actually add that will have a pretty big use case in Intune specifically is we do also have the republish during next sync specific for Intune. Now, the reason this can actually be quite helpful is with Microsoft Intune, if you change one of these right-click options, Previously, they would never update until the next version comes out. And that's just because with Microsoft Intune, everything is included in the Intune Win file, and that includes all the customizations, which cannot be modified on the fly like we can with Configuration Manager apps, where we can see that source location. We can't see what settings have been changed in Microsoft Intune. But let's say that you did change different settings. Maybe you added a custom pre or post script, or you've changed some of the right-click options. What the Republish feature will do with Microsoft Intune specifically is it will automatically replace the content, including the customizations included in that package, on the next synchronization. So if you enable this right-click option, after you've changed some of these right-click options for an app that's already been published or an update that's already been published, and then if you run a synchronization, that's going to replace the Intune Win file with the new customizations, where previously what you would have had to do is you actually would have had to come in here, delete the app, and then have it recreate a brand new app, which wasn't a great experience. But with this one, you'll simply replace the installer basically on the back end when the sync runs, and then all the customizations that were applied before right-clicking and choosing Republish will now be in the same exact application that we've simply replaced the content for. So that pretty much includes all the features that we've released since April to October. Hopefully you learned something new here, saw a feature that maybe you had missed. And if you have any feedback, feel free to leave a comment in the video below. Thank you for watching.